Barry, thank you. So just to state the obvious, this is going to be an historically difficult period for American journalism, a challenge in every regard. All independent institutions are under attack, journalism in particular. I thought that leading a newsroom through the first Trump era was hard, testing all of the rules. This one will be far, far more difficult. It will make the previous one seem easy, even peaceful by comparison. And by the way, the hard questions about covering Trump are no harder than those surrounding the struggles of our business or the difficulties ahead for local news organizations. It's hard to tell what to make of his rapid fire, seat of the pants, back of the envelope proposals. Will they shut down USAID? Will the US really take over Gaza? Do you take any of these proposals seriously? Or is it part of Steve Bannon's notion that the goal is to flood the zone and confuse a media that he thinks is dumb? Change the subject fast before they notice their plans are collapsing. Ignore the most outrageous proposals and your readers say you're not capturing the chaos of the moment. Cover them too much and critics say you're giving them too much credit. Meanwhile, if you watch the interviews President Trump and his supporters have given, you will see a greater aggression toward the press. They interrupt interviewers when they don't like questions. They brook no debate and don't accept journalism as an independent profession worthy of questioning them. They just booted mainstream journalists out of our Pentagon office, out of the Pentagon press office, in favor of a couple of news organizations that can generously be called supportive of the new administration. I have no doubt that the central tenets that we embrace, like the Sullivan case even, will be challenged. I hang on the view of many lawyer friends that there is some quiet support for it in the court. But regardless of the law, the president's attacks will continue to erode our standing. And of course, it comes at a time when many organizations are financially weaker, when we're in the middle of important debates about our role and how we carry out our mission. It comes at a time when some of the biggest journalism players are controlled by people who feel the need to protect their other larger businesses. If you're a reporter for the Washington Post, which continues to do absolutely fabulous journalism, it was chilling to see your owner standing on the dais during the inauguration. If you're a reporter for the Los Angeles Times, which has done absolutely amazing work covering the fires and is still a great newspaper, it's hard to watch tweets from an owner who seems not to like journalism sometimes, or at least not to like some journalists. And if you're a journalist at 60 Minutes right now, you are likely petrified that the network's owners are about to do something that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. Settle a lawsuit filed by the president that everyone believes is outright silly, just to make sure the US government doesn't stop a blockbuster merger. If CBS settles that lawsuit, it will erode the standing of one of the greatest television ventures, one that helped pioneer hard-hitting, questioning reporting. But it will hurt us, all of us, profoundly, offering proof that even frivolous lawsuits can be won in this era. It won't set a legal precedent, I suspect, but it will set a moral. As for the owners of the Post and the Los Angeles Times, I actually understand their desire to broaden their audience. It isn't healthy for journalism or democracy that the best news organizations, including the Times itself, or the terrific Guardian, are most attractive to liberal audiences, leaving the rest of America to a hodgepodge of media that includes Fox News and its snarky hosts. But the solution to that over time is to do better independent journalism, not to resort to attacking your own journalists in their work. This is also being felt in local newsroom, where it receives less notice. I've worked with more than 24 newsrooms over the last 2 years and spent time with a dozen more as part of the Times program to help small organizations do local investigative reporting. The work ranges from Salt Lake City to Florida, from Baltimore and suburbs of Mississippi. Most of these newsrooms have stories of politicians who've begun slow-walking FOIA requests, or who mimic the Trump playbook for attacks on our credibility. When Christopher Damian of the Desert Sun, working with the Times, reported on systematic abuses in Riverside County jails, the sheriff didn't bother to refute the charges. He simply attacked Chris as being too sympathetic to criminals. When we helped the Baltimore Banner report on the fentanyl crisis and the city's failures to grapple with it, city officials actually accused all of us of being in bed in the pharmaceutical industry. And Mississippi Today, one of the biggest and best of the new ventures, is involved in a life or death struggle with a former governor who isn't challenging facts, just the paper's right to report them. Is it any wonder that our connection to the audience are fraying, that trust in the media is dropping? So how do we cover this administration? And how do we begin to win back some of the trust we've lost? First off, to steal a line from my friend Dick Toffel, formerly of ProPublica, the country may not trust us, but they seem to believe us. Yes, Donald Trump won 2 elections, but after years of aggressive reporting about his finances, his treatment of women, and the poor handling of the COVID crisis, he is among the least popular presidents in American modern history. And it remains true that when we engage in big, ambitious journalism, like the Times' coverage of Harvey Weinstein, the Globe's coverage of abuses by Catholic priests, or the Guardian's coverage of WikiLeaks, there comes profound change. In fact, let's not forget in our anxiety, we do get to be anxious a lot, I find. Let's not forget that some of the most profound movements of the past generation came from newspaper stories. I would like to offer up a few suggestions on the current plight of the media, and with much humility, admit it will be really hard and may take years, if not generations. Also, with acknowledgement that there are no easy answers. Then I would like to close with a long hand to what I think is the most important mission of the coming years. First off, in covering Trump, we have to cover what he says. If we have learned anything, is that he will say and try even the most outlandish things. I'm not sure anyone on the right or the left believe that Kash Patel might one day run the FBI. And how do you ignore it when the President of the United States insists, even though it's improbable, that he will take over Gaza with more than 1 million Palestinians removed from it? But I think we need to put more emphasis than we did in the past on going deep into what he actually does, to do the deep reporting inside the Justice Department and the State Department. It's a lot harder than it sounds, but we have to balance reporting with covering his claims. We also have to be absolutely radically transparent about how we do our work, how we make decisions. When I was managing editor of the Los Angeles Times, I led a group of reporters who examined allegations that Arnold Schwarzenegger groped women, allegations that were later confirmed. The stories ran during a recall election, just days before the vote. We lost 5,000 subscribers. I actually tried to call some of them. And you know what? They had not understood why we had to publish on the election. They just didn't understand the architecture of an election. When I explained it, some of them understood. I should have done that in the beginning. High up in the stories themselves, separately, I should have told them. Fast forward years later, when I was editor of the Times and we obtained Trump's tax returns, I wrote a letter to readers explaining why it was important that we publish them. Because I understood that some readers might not like to see that kind of personal information published about anyone. Everyone got that story. Everyone understood that story. There was no reader uprising. Don't assume your readers believe. Make them believe you. Show them your work. Put your reporters on video if you can, so readers can see they're normal people. In the time when advertising ruled, we were too arrogant toward our readers. We took for granted that they had no choice but to read us. In fact, in most communities, they didn't have any choice but to read us. It instilled in us some bad habits, like the notion that the story speaks for itself, that linger today. The story should speak for itself, but we should speak for it too. Be willing to do some stories that might upset your audiences. During the last election, I said it was fair to ask hard questions about Biden's age. I was heckled at one journalism event saying, anyone who watched the Biden-Trump debate must admit that this was an appropriate line of reporting. Maybe we should have pursued more aggressively and sooner. Finally, and most importantly, we need to restore reporting to the center of journalism. In my new job, I've spent days meeting one-on-one with beat reporters at the Baltimore Banner. I've parked for a week in newsrooms in Jackson, Mississippi, from the venerable Clarion Ledger, which when I grew up in New Orleans was a ginormous paper. The exciting upstart Mississippi Today, where Anna Wolf a couple of years ago set the government on its head with stories about how the rich abused the state welfare program. When I went to the Jackson Clarion Ledger, which took up a whole block in downtown Jackson, this was one of the grandest papers in the Southeast. There was a little sign pasted on the door saying, call the cell phone of the editor if you want to come in. And I called him, he came down and let me in. There was this cavernous lobby, completely empty. The chairs turned on the table. He'd invited me to do an all-hands meeting. I went up into an all-hands meeting. I think all hands were about 20 max. I met Deanna Tisdale, publisher of the Jackson Advocate, the leading Black-owned publication in town. She was studying to be an opera singer in Massachusetts when she realized she could use her stirring voice in a different way by running the paper her father used to. And of course, I met the legendary Jerry Mitchell, who has built a storied career calling out injustices in the state, from civil rights killings to contemporary abuses by local sheriffs, a series of stories we work with on. If you want a glimpse of the future of journalism, its problems and its inspirations, you could do worse than make a trip to Jackson, Mississippi. Every piece of the puzzle is there. The storied daily paper, once owned by a powerful and patrician Southern family. Its reporters still working really hard, even though their numbers can barely fill a conference room in a mostly empty building in downtown Jackson. I'm not one of those, by the way, who takes any pleasure in beating up Gannett or any of the big chains. There are lots of fantastic reporters who are covering their hometowns and working really hard. And there's a startup Mississippi Today, which I've talked about. Aggressive, going hard after abusive police and government officials. What has struck me in these newsrooms is how different the conversations were from the ones dominated by media critics. They were not quarreling over Twitter. They were not asking esoteric questions. They were talking about the basics, the essentials, the DNA of journalism. They wanted to talk about how to get recalcitrant people to talk. They wanted to talk about how to make people see their education system was in crisis. How do we come up with fresh ways to capture the tragedy of American prisons so that people notice? How do we call attention to the fact that the Mississippi health system is in shambles? It doesn't seem to be mentioned in statewide political debates. Why are Wisconsin jails so bad? How do we reach the point that Jackson's water is so bad that the city has occasionally warned people to close their mouths when they shower? Why do some sheriffs in Mississippi seem to think it's still 1950? Why does Baltimore have so many overdose deaths? Why does no one talk about the environment in my home state of Louisiana, a state in crisis? I think I visited these newsrooms expecting to find despair. But what I found is that in the actual daily living of American journalism, reporters and editors are working really hard. They're short-staffed, but looking for ways to keep the essential and large stories at the forefront. In many ways, in lots of ways, they're better than my generation, as Barry put it. They're more diverse, they're more skeptical of police, given the events of the past few years. They're better at gathering and understanding data. I've sat in rooms, and I don't understand AI, in which they have managed to go through reams of information and facts using AI. They think harder about their audiences than we ever did. They must to survive. They're fair and nonpartisan, but they seem less likely to fall for some of the knee-jerk aspects of occasionally extreme both sides journalism. And boy, they're also having fun. They're chasing stories, reporting hard, and willing to try anything. Sometimes when I visited these newsrooms, I would go in depressed by their struggles. Or more often, I was thrilled by their ingenuity, their ambition to go big, even if they need help trying to figure out how to get there. After watching them, I have some thoughts about what we can do better and how. One reason they were having fun is that they're out in their communities reporting, not opining, not bloviating on social media. And today, that is what I would like to talk about just a bit to close out. I love journalism in all its forms, but I love reporting the most. Some of the greatest fun and the most profound moments of my life have taken place with an empty notebook in my hand. There are many challenges to our craft these days. Some, like the future of local news and the struggles to regain trust, are big and daunting and feel almost impossible to solve. Some, like the debate over objectivity and independence, are healthy for us to discuss a new generation or so, lest we become lazy in our habits. But there is one discussion that, to my mind, is not being held often enough. One that runs the risk of slipping by as we turn our attention to more glittering objects like the future of AI and the state of objectivity. There's too much talk about framing, too much hand-wringing about headlines that are off, and not enough talk about the beauty and joy of open-minded, empathetic reporting, of going out into the world unsure of where the story is headed, of banging on doors, of listening with open mind and open heart. The dramatic drop in the number of reporters is scary and widely known, but that's only part of the story. There's a simple fact that news organizations have many more crafts than before, and many of them do not involve knocking on doors. These are journalists too. They're vital to our future, but they're not doing the reporting I'm describing. The deepest, most fearless reporting lets you say bold things. It lets you say that Tucker Carlson ran the most openly racist, and divisive television program in generations. It lets you say that Donald Trump has sometimes made his fortune by stiffing others. It allows you to prove without doubt, no matter what the government says, that many, many civilians are being killed in American airstrikes. It placed David Farrenhold, when he was at the Post, on the trail of a bad charity, and Craig Whitlock of the Post onto the lies that caused an escalation of the war in Afghanistan. The deepest reporting allowed a team of Republican reporters to spark a new debate about the ethics of the nation's highest court, a debate that still resonates. The best reporters go out looking for surprises that illuminate larger truths. They know they don't have all the answers when they start out. One of the best examples I've seen of late was on the front page of the Times a couple of years ago, and it was by the great Eli Zaslow. It was a story of Joe and Debbie Falacci, who were struggling to make a go of their small sandwich shop in Phoenix. The problem is that the business was smack against the giant homeless encampment, and the ensuing conflict was the stuff of literature. Joe's business is ravaged because people are urinating outside. Shots have been fired, and one disturbed woman wanders in making demands. Joe started out generous with his new neighbors, sympathetic to them, but he's nearing a limit. He wants to stay, his wife wants out, but it hardly matters. Potential buyers see the homeless encampment and run the other way. But in fact, there's another side to the story of the shattered lives and poverty of the people who lost their homes, some to mental illness. In Eli's world, there are no easy answers. In fact, if he collected his work in a book, and I hope he does, it would be called No Easy Answers. The best stories are complicated, nuanced. As my colleague, the great poverty reporter Jason DeParle said, the great lesson of reporting is that the world is almost always more complicated and unlikely than it seems when you're at your desk. And Eli knows that lesson. He hangs out with his subjects every day. Indeed, the people who are pushing the Falaccis out of business are deeply troubled. Some of them pushed out themselves by one of the nation's hottest real estate markets. Others were let down by a failing mental health system that can't quite figure out what to do with some of the nation's most disturbed people. And as their stories unfold, your heart breaks for everybody in the story. Sheena Sepulveda, for example, one of the people in the encampment, claims to have escaped from a cult and believes she's a Rockefeller. She also believes she's a surgeon. Eli writes about her with empathy and respect. A delusional Florence Nightingale, she stitches the wounds of a man who got cut trying to protect his tiny piece of the encampment. She dabs the wound with a napkin, and when she is done, she tosses the bloody, pus-filled napkin to the ground, an artifact of a sweet and gentle act from one troubled person to another. But when the Falaccis arrive to open their restaurant and see the same bloody, pus-filled napkin on the ground, they see a different kind of artifact, an affront, another reason to live. That is reporting. That is witnessing. That is hanging around long enough until you see the truth, the complexity of the story. Reporting or witnessing or finding things out is the central act of journalism. The best reporters have empathy. They disdain using the word I too often, and they don't go out into the world just trying to affirm what they already believe. As I said at the outset, this will be an extraordinarily hard time for all of journalism. But in my travels across the country, I've also seen newsrooms filled with energy, new thinking, and not so much hand-wringing. So I'm not going to do too much. Upstarts trying to figure out what to keep of the old while inventing new forms and new notions of coverage. These remarks are from someone who sincerely believes in the power and necessity of journalism. Someone who's been in the newsroom since he was 19, since I didn't finish college. Someone who believes that despite the challenges, one of the simplest answers is to report, learn things, and break stories. It's the most important tool we have. And as we remake the profession, as we debate the future, thank you.
So we're going to have a panel after Dean's remarks, but I think that the audience should ask a few questions of him if you have any questions for him after that. He's just summed it up so well, we might not, we're stunned into silence, but I
That's my goal, study.
Back over to get behind you.
Here's a question.
So that was just fabulous. And of the various horror stories that you talked about, one that has been bothering me intensely is the 60 Minutes story. And I guess I want to ask you, how common is it for a program to take a snippet of an interview and have it be in a trailer, and then different snippets, maybe in addition to that one or even without it, in the actual program? And then, I mean, where are the damages? Doesn't this plaintiff have to prove damages, and how
Yeah.
does he even begin to do that? And any thoughts you
Yeah.
can have to calm
It's
me
common,
down
yeah.
about that?
It's common, that's editing. Jake Tapper did a very thoughtful essay that's worth finding, in which he talks about how common it is. I've never worked in television. And he uses a classic example of one where there was fine editing by Fox of an interview with Donald Trump. It's common. Essentially, she said the same thing. She didn't say a whole lot, and I didn't quote, but essentially she said the same thing, and that's editing. There was no malicious, a malicious editing would have been if you tried to make it look better, if you tried to make it look worse. It really wasn't that. This is every lawyer I've talked to, and when I first saw, when the Times first reported that he was on the verge of settling, I wrote to like 5 lawyers, and all of them were completely freaked out. They didn't even put up a fight, by the way, when the commission asked for them, or for all of their rough notes. I think if I were them, right after Trump filed his lawsuit, I would have published everything. That's my point about radical transparency. You want to ask a question? Here's my stuff. You know, here's everything. I think if you'd seen all the stuff, which I have, because it's now published, you would have seen there wasn't anything to it. This is the case that scares me the most of this stuff. It does. Just because it's not, look, I think I have been sued, I have made mistakes. Journalists make mistakes. And when journalists make mistakes, they should own up to them. I have some very embarrassing ones. I hope you don't Google to look up. When journalists make mistakes, they should own up to them. They didn't make a mistake. And nobody thinks they did.
Over here?
Dean, in all of your positions.
This is my fellow Louisianian. Listen to his accent. It's
I'm
different from mine.
The accent though.
I lost it, so I don't know how it happened.
I don't know.
Drifted away.
But listen, I'm very proud to be here because, you have had an amazing career, but I'm curious to know, because I'm on the front lines, as you know, of several small people.
Yeah.
And I have been pretty hard hitting, and I am frustrated because I think the public, I guess my question to you is, why is the public so disinterested? And I think it's because, and I'll give you what my thing is, I think if Americans understood government like they did football, we'd have a much better country. I think they want to be involved, but they just don't know. They just don't know what to ask, who to go to, or who to believe. And I think, local governments, it's not a lot of money, but 50 million here, 40 million here, 30 million here, there's a lot of stuff going on. And it's not always good government, and it's hard to really get their attention. So I guess my question to you is, what responsibility do we have to educate the public, and why are they not responding?
Our response, first off, the one thing you have to absolve yourself of, we can't take responsibility for everything. We just can't. But there's a lot we should take responsibility for. I actually think that if you think people don't understand how government works, do as many primers as you can to explain. Sometimes, here are the things that we've done. I say this as somebody who's written stories that I look back at, I really like it, what they actually said. We sometimes, since you use the football analogy, I'll use it. If you landed from another country and you try to follow American football, and you pick up the sports section, any of the great American sports sections, you would have no idea what it was about. And that we feel no obligation to explain. I think when it comes to government, if you want to take one agency every year, and you're going to say, okay, this year, because I'm a small newspaper, I'm not the New York Times, I can't take 20. I'm going to take one agency. and I'm gonna explain it to you, calling up to complain. And I'm gonna run something prominently as often as I can, that just explains how it works, who works there, as I'm investigating it, as I'm uncovering along. I do think that, will it work all the time? No, this is a generational fight. So it won't work all the time, but boy, it'll help a lot.
And yes,
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm a German professor, so I'm familiar with the German journalistic landscape a little bit. And one thing that I noticed before is that in Germany, you've got the Social Democrat newspaper, you've got the Christian Democrats newspaper. And I feel like in the past, it was less like that in the United States.
It was actually more like that in the United States in the beginning.
Well, in the beginning, okay, but maybe when I was younger,
Right.
it didn't seem that way, but it seems more like that now. And I guess, you mentioned the reporting on Biden's
Age.
challenges and
Yeah.
age, right? And I couldn't help but notice that the Wall Street Journal had really tried to report on that and really got squashed because of that.
Right.
And in fact, Times had not really been pushing that. And I'm just wondering if that's an aspect of a kind of, I don't know, activism or partisanship on the part of the newspapers that's increased over the years. And what do you think about that?
That's a good question. It was a hard story. This is not an excuse. I have a window into what was being reported because I wasn't editor at the Times the last election. It was a very hard story. The people around him were spinning, and even the Journal story, which was the first one to get at it, if you look closely, a lot of anonymous sources, I'm not knocking it, I wish I'd had it, but anonymous sources, and a lot of people and a lot of people a lot of Republicans in Congress quoted, it was a story that at the normal story didn't quite make the ball. I don't think it was partisan, honestly. I think part of it is, we may be a little bit too, I don't want to say afraid, that's not the right thing. We got beat up a lot when we were about Democrats. I was, as I said, before that story ran, I talked about Biden's age, and a very well-known journalism professor who worked in California, not at this university, was in the back of the room and actually heckled me. They're saying we should write about Biden. So I think that Trump catalyzed so much energy, and there was so much to write about. I do think it created, I'm not talking about the New York Times, but in the press in general, a little bit of a whataboutism. Like if you wanna write a story about Biden's age, there are people over here saying, yeah, but look how old Trump is. And I think there was too much of that, and maybe it made, I'm not talking about any news organization, period. I think it might have made people a little more timid. I don't think that's reflective. I mean, when I was running the New York Times, we spent years writing about the Obama administration buildup of the drone. It was other than Harvey Weinstein, it was the thing I put the most energy in because I thought the country had not had a debate. And I think Barack Obama turned up the volume considerably on drones, and I wasn't worried about the fact. That's a not full answer, frankly, because I think I'd have to think about it some more. Yeah.
anyone else? We have time for a little bit more. Yeah,
Thank you very much, and thanks for the inspiration at the end for young journalists. But the words I heard at the end very often were deep stories, complicated, complex, go after the issues, pursue these things. On the other hand, there's very simple narratives that are being used. DEI caused a plane crash. DEI is bringing the country down. DEI is, right? Very simple narratives, straightforward. Is there a place for something like that in journalism, or is that just politics?
Yeah, don't read deep from me as meaning 6 months. In fact, one of the things that I'm learning working with these smaller newsrooms, they don't all have 6 months or so. I mean, I actually think that it's easier now to do fast turnaround, deep stories. There's just much more information available. So no, I'm talking about fast. I'm talking about some stories do take many months. The fentanyl stories we did with the Baltimore Banner took almost a year. But some stories can take a week. And some stories, if you plan them right, can even take days.
But there's still sort of, you're still interested in kind of complexity, and it's sometimes just what we're being hit with,
I
it's
see what you're saying.
just a straightforward, very
You're right.
simple
You're
narrative,
right.
and they're lies,
No, you're right.
but they're
You're right.
very
No,
straightforward.
you're right.
They give answers
You're
right away.
absolutely right. I'm gonna steal that paragraph. If I ever give this speech again, I'm gonna talk. You're absolutely right. Not everything has to be. In my zeal to talk about reporting, I was probably talking about the kind of reporting I did as a young reporter, but you're absolutely right. Some things are right in front of our faces and should be simple, and we should get rid of the clutter and just write it. Completely agree. I'll give you credit.
This will be our second to last one.
I really appreciate, I'm Angela Shire, I'm Charlottesville tomorrow, Middle Virginia, building up local newsroom there. I really appreciated your naming of some of these newsrooms that are often not named. My question for you is sort of about the consolidation of national news chains and big papers, and also the consolidation between large national outlets and some of the tech companies as well, where the New York Times and organizations make deals with Facebook. I mean, the New York Times sneezes and local newsrooms get it, right? Like, so, like if 60 Minutes, if CBS gets into this lawsuit, actually it will be the small papers that will feel the brunt of that emboldenedness.
And the New York Times.
And the New York Times,
Yeah,
right? So
and
I'm
the
wondering if you
Washington,
could talk a
everybody.
little bit about that period when, what organizations were thinking when they began to make these deals with large
I
tech
can-
companies and consolidate.
I can talk about that. So when I first was named executive editor of the New York Times, when I spent time looking at the economics of the place, Newsroom was 1,200. And my first speech to the company, because the executive editor used to give a whole, I said, painfully, we were gonna have to get smaller. And God, when I left, it was 2,000. It's more than that. But I thought we were gonna get smaller. The reason, I mean, Facebook Live, the reason I did a deal with Facebook Live was because I thought that would save 100 jobs, because Facebook was gonna give us money. If I had to do it over again, I'd probably do it anyway to save jobs. I think there was a period when we were all fighting for our lives. And we were playing a game that none of us fully had a hand in. How do you deal with social media? How do you build audiences? How do you interact with people who have these promises of helping you build audiences? We're far past that now. It seems like a generation ago now. It was only 6 or 7 years ago. And I think that's why we, struck some of those deals. We were, not just the New York Times, Post, every newsroom in the country, where we were fighting for our lives. I mean, nobody, I remember the period because, now everybody talks about the New York Times as this great financial success. But my first couple of years as editor, we did layoffs, buyouts. It was really painful. And we were, some of the best things we did to save the institution were because we were willing to say yes. I remember when a group of editors came into my office to pitch me on the Daily. I don't think I'd ever listened to Baquet. I said yes. And then some of the dumbest things we did was because during the same period of saying yes, we said yes to things. So somebody will write a great book about the 4 or 5 years where newspapers are fighting to save themselves. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah,
Hi.
my students will have.
I was begging over here for a minute. Thank you so much for that talk. I am kind of part of the younger generation where my friends aren't reading newspapers, they're watching TikTok. And in that era, anyone can take out their phone and be a citizen reporter and get millions of followers. And these people trust someone that is untrained, someone that we don't know their ethical code.
Yeah.
And maybe they're just stealing information from someone else. Where do you see the future of print journalism and media? I mean, the Washington Post is amazing on TikTok. I love them there. And I seriously check them out. They're great. They have
They're
this
going
little
where
sense.
the one thing we have learned, go where the readers are. My generation was too slow to get that. My generation of readers, like, if the go where the readers are and compete with others. I was at a conference in New Orleans last week of editors of small news organizations, and I was the only one from a big news organization, and there were some influencers. And one of them got a really good one. One of them got up and said, you know, we could do business together. You teach us how to do this. You know, we're not looking to make shit up. You teach us how to have standards. You help us come up with standards. And we will teach you how to play. And, you know, I thought, this is great. Yeah. So you go where the readers are, you have to, and wherever they are, you go. And you go, and this is something that took us long, you go in the language of that medium. It's like when newspapers first went online, we said, here's my newspaper story, and I'm gonna put it online. And of course, it didn't take advantage of the medium. It just was like, you know, trying to bend the medium to you, and that's not the way to do it.
Anyone else?
Just one in a second.
Yeah.
I have a kind of a similar question, not exactly the same question, but I feel like what I find better about the social media thing is that my peers will become really, really impassioned when they see certain headlines or whatever, and they'll be like, this is so wrong, like very loudly on social media. But then as soon as something serves them through that social media, they'll completely disregard it. And I think that goes to what Professor Siegel was saying, kind of about the short attention spans that are happening. Like I'm thinking of when TikTok came back and it said, we're so grateful for President Trump to be doing this. And everyone just kept TikTok and they were saying, this is obviously propaganda, but I'm keeping TikTok. And I just don't know what to do about that.
Well, you can't, remember what I said in the beginning, you can't, and by the way, thus it has always been, you cannot get every reader to love you. You cannot get every reader to want what you're offering. Frankly, they never have. We convinced ourselves in the print era that they were, I mean, when I was a reporter in the print era, before there was an internet, working for the States item in New Orleans, I just assumed everybody read my stories. And that's why, in fact, why they bought the paper. My story. That's not why everybody, some of them were buying the paper just to get the classifieds. The most, what you have to do is, like, again, fearlessly follow your reader. Don't be afraid of new technologies. And hold on to your standards. Understand that technologies change how we write, how we think, and how we present journalism, and that's okay. And also understand you can't win every battle. We never had a new reader. It was a myth. If we had the kinds of surveys then that we have now, we would have found that a staggering number of people were buying my old Times Picayune for the classified ads, and were not reading, well, they were reading my stories. They were not reading anybody, just mine.
And the LSU story.
And the LSU stuff.
Here, one more, because again, this is a special interest. Good luck.
I am probably cheating because I'm going to be.
You are cheating.
Of the panel, but to elaborate on this brilliant question, the student asked, I was thinking of like, how do you, the algorithm of social medias are not made for truth. They're not tailored to favor deep quality, complex journalism. So my question is, how do you keep your ethics? How do you foster public understanding while operating in these spaces?
That's a really good question. First off, you have to, and I say this when I visit a lot of smaller news organizations, young news organizations that have been around for 2 or 3 years. It's easy to say I have my ethic. You need to figure out what am I about? And that's not just ethics, by the way. We've always had, I mean, I think of the New York Times and the LA Times and the Washington Post as nonpartisan independent news organization. We've always had a nation and it did good journalism, and we've always had a national media and it did good journalism. So not everybody has to play the game the exact same way. But I think you have to hold on to your ethics. You have to know what they are. Everybody in the newsroom has to know what they are. You have to talk about them constantly. And everybody's got to understand. And then I think you need to let your readers in on them. We suck at it. Let your readers know, here's what our ethics are. Here's what we will do. Here's what we don't do. Here's what we did in this story. And if it seemed like we deviated in this story, here's how that happened and here's why that happened. We're not good at that. We just like, I hate to say it, but we can sometimes be like a manufacturing plant where we like manufacture our stuff every day and we don't stop and say, well, wait a minute, this story has 6 anonymous sources in it. Readers gonna look at that. We know readers don't believe everything they, and nor should they, everything from anonymous sources. We either need to cut that to 2, or we need to just say, look, level with them. This story has 6 anonymous sources in it. We don't usually like to do that, but here's why we're doing it, and it's important. So I just think if you lose your ethics, and you know, this is what I'm afraid of with 50 minutes, frankly. Then you know, you want to just like, I'm gonna say it, you shouldn't lose your ethics.
Okay, thank you, Dean. Okay, panel. Please proceed to the seats we've arranged here. We'll find out now if these microphones. Thanks so much. Does it work? Okay, no, do it like that. Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much. That was great. This panel, I think, is a little more international than your talk was meant to be. And so I'm going to lean into that a little bit. I think a lot of what you were talking about applies more broadly internationally. And the very weakness of the business model still is a problem internationally. I know in France it is, and elsewhere in the world. So I wanted to start by introducing my entire panel from the get-go, rather than one by one each time you speak. This is Jodie Ginsberg. Jodie's been the chief executive of the Committee to Protect Journalists since 2022. Before that, she was CEO for Internews Europe, and again before that, led the Index on Censorship, the London-based Freedom of Expression group, for 6 years. Her earlier work was as a correspondent for Reuters in Johannesburg, and she later ran Reuters' UK and Ireland bureau. Widlore Mérancourt comes to us from Haiti via motorbike over mountains, past lakes, and through a third of the country before getting to the open airport in Cap-Haïtien and flying out to the States. He is, which I followed every step of, what's that? He's the editor-in-chief of the independent Haitian, Creole, French, English news organization, AyiboPost. He's based in Port-au-Prince and is also a frequent contributor to the Washington Post. Hector Tobar, my colleague, is a novelist and journalist who worked for many years in various positions at the LA Times and was their bureau chief in Mexico City and in Buenos Aires. He has published several novels and nonfiction books, including Deep Down Dark, about the 33 Chilean miners who were buried in a 2010 mining accident and survived. That book was a finalist for the 2014 National Book Critics Circle Award in General Nonfiction. Hector has written for The New Yorker, the LA Weekly, the New York Times, and the LA Times, and teaches in the literary journalism program here and in Chicano and Latino studies also here at Irvine. He was part of the Pulitzer Prize winning team who covered the LA riots in 1992. Not to date him, but I like to do that to other people. And in 2023, he was named a Guggenheim Fellow. Alan Weisman has worked in more than 60 countries on 7 continents in the Caribbean and in Oceania. The author of 6 books, his next, Hope Dies Last, will be a spring 2025 release from Dutton Penguin. His awards include the LA Times Book Prize, the Paris Book Festival Prize for Nonfiction, and the National Library of China's Wenjin Book Prize. His book, The World Without Us, was a finalist for the Rachel Carson Prize, the J. Anthony Lucas Prize, and the National Book Critics Circle Award, and was named Top Nonfiction Book of 2007 by Time and Entertainment Week. It has been translated into 35 languages. When I wrote this, it had been translated into 34, and then Alan had to correct me. He's written for the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, The Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, Discover, and Orion, and Vanity Fair, and many other publications. and his work has been reprinted in several collections of essays. So thank you, everyone. So Jodie, I have questions for you myself, but I want to let you respond to what Dean was saying, especially about the CBS case and the Des Moines Register case and the threat to reporting in the US now. And do you feel the thinning out of the newsroom, which I argue globally, nationally, and locally contributes to journalists' vulnerability around the globe? Do you think you could do some of that?
Some of that in a very short
Yeah,
space
2
of
minutes,
time.
you get
2
2
minutes.
minutes, and whatever you wanted to say in the first place.
So look, I think Dee said it very well at the beginning. These are not normal times. And I think the important thing to stress is these are not normal times in the United States, but they have been not normal times globally for some time. The Committee to Protect Journalists has been working for 40 years. We've been documenting killings of journalists, arrests of journalists, restrictions on press freedom for at least 3 decades. This now, 2025, 2024 is the most dangerous time to be a journalist that we have ever recorded. And what I think is really important to note, and I agree with everything Dean said about digging in and going back to our roots as journalists, but there are some things that we have learned from the work that we have done in other places that I think are really important to think about here. And there are 5 that I think we need to think about in addition from our work. One is we know that there is going to be a serious uptick in legal and regulatory threats. We've seen it already with the CBS cases, not just at federal level, but at local level, where it hits hardest. We don't all have a New York Times budget to deal with these kinds of cases. They are often brought maliciously, intentionally to drain the resources of the newsroom, and it's very effective. So we need to be ready for that. We need to make sure that there are resources to enable those local newsrooms to fight back when the local governor, when the local education board, when whomever decides that they're going to go after journalists. We also expect many more regulatory attacks on journalists. We're already seeing the FCC starting to intervene in the workings of newsrooms over here in California. We saw it last week. Just after the election, we had a call at CPJ for 125 nonprofit newsrooms who all wanted to know how to prepare for what happens if the federal government or states start to come after their 501c3 status. Those are problems that nobody was talking about in the preceding months. So legal and regulatory is the first. The second is digital. We have seen in recent years a huge spike in harassment online of journalists, particularly women and those from minority communities. We can expect an increase here, so people need to be prepared. They need to know how to deal with it and what systems you've got in place to support your newsrooms. Sadly, I also expect an uptick in the use of spyware and surveillance. The third is physical. When you essentially call journalists enemies of the people and create an environment in which journalists are seen as less than people, you also essentially say it's fair game to go after them physically, and we expect those kinds of attacks. So last year, we were involved in training over 900 journalists here in the United States on a variety of safety issues, including digital and physical safety. So legal, digital, physical. The fourth one, and I think this speaks strongly to the CBS point, is self-censorship. Self-censorship is the big unseen consequence of the preceding 3 issues. And I think it's the deadly one because we can't, by its nature, you don't talk about it. So really thinking about how we're going to encourage newsrooms that are starting to see editors or indeed publishers start to lean on them. How do we encourage them to be able to talk openly about that and the kinds of things that they're not being allowed to talk about? And then just finally, the other thing I think, because we're looking at this from a global perspective, I think we cannot underestimate the enormous impact that the decision to cut all USAID and state funding is going to have on the international media community. Many places in the world, their free and independent press is entirely funded through development budgets for obvious reasons, because they are operating in environments that are not conducive for press freedom. If you take that money away, you essentially open up the room for the dictators and the autocrats to stomp all over independent journalists, and that's going to have a devastating effect on press freedom worldwide. So I think while understandably we'll want to have a lot of focus on press freedom challenges here, I think we should not ignore what's likely to happen elsewhere.
Thank you. Thank you. Widlore, you want to address some of these issues and talk a little bit about what we were talking about in the corridor, about how the Haitian situation and flooding the waves, so to speak.
About press freedom?
Yeah, press freedom, and how you've dealt with threats against journalists in Haiti.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I think if we are to speak about journalists on the fire, and if we are to speak about the impact of different networks have to concrete reporters going around and doing their job, Haiti is the right place to start. Last year, the Committee to Protect Journalists published a report explaining how since 2019, about 7 journalists in Haiti were killed, in the course of doing their jobs, reporting. And Haiti and Israel, quite a peculiar list here, are the best place to kill journalists if you want to go unpunished for your act, right? And it was a report from the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I want to applaud them for the terrific job they are doing, accompanying journalists on a day-to-day basis, journalists facing threats for their work personally, but also journalists covering the country facing threats not because of their work, but because of the environments they're creating, right?
Explain a little bit, because not everybody knows.
Yes, so myself personally, last year I published a report about 2 Reuters journalists who came to Haiti, and they brought to the biggest gang leader of the country face masks and cigarettes and alcohol.
Face masks and what else?
Cigarettes and alcohol. And I have to make sure everybody understands this is not the vast majority of journalists who came to Haiti who does that, but it's something I uncovered in the course of my own reporting that they would do quite often. They would bring face masks. Ethically, you give these face masks, the gangs are going to use it to commit acts of violence, right? It's going to be used in the course of their own gangs activities.
Oh, not like COVID, not like
No.
COVID.
No, face mask.
Oh,
Full
Mask covering entirely your face.
Good question.
And in the course of the reporting, what I realized is, other than this, you have a whole culture of journalists coming to Haiti, bringing thousands of dollars, paying fixers. Fixers are those, being in the middle, between reporters and sources, and helping them covering the countries that they go in, and they would pay thousands of dollars in a context where people don't have a lot of money, and some of this money is going to the gang members, and the gangs are going to use it in their businesses and buying guns and etc. So you have this cycle of journalists coming to the country, fostering an environment where actually they are not interested in what Mr. Baquet was saying earlier about complexity, about depth. They are more interested in the sensationalism of going to talk to gang leaders. And on top of that, the harmful narrative, they are also bringing things, money, face masks to gang members that are going to be used in the gang activities. And you have actually journalism contributing to the violence, and also you have the cycle perpetuating. right? I published this report and I was personally threatened by the biggest gang member of Haiti who put out a video name calling me more than 3 or 4 times in my own news organization. So you have that on one side, but on the other side also, you also have the fact that if you are working in Haiti, the whole environment of violence is going to have an impact on you, right? We have the capital of Haiti, home to more than about 3 million people, up to 85% controlled by gang members. I, as a news leader, because I'm the editor-in-chief of a local news organization, we have to meet our budget, of course, but we also have to take money to relocate journalists. On the past 2 to 3 years, we relocated about 12 journalists.
For safety,
and collaborators
for safety
safety reasons, right? We have to invest in, mental health, programs for our own journalists to be able to cope with the violence.
You need the committee to protect journalists, come in to train you.
I mean, that's our fastest growing area is XR support and trauma support. So XR support grew something like 227% last year, and trauma support is one of our fastest growing, unfortunately, areas because of this, because it's not just the attacks coming on the journalists, but it's the material that they're having to cover that is traumatic in
Yes.
itself.
Yes.
What happened after the gang leaders? Brett, the 3 or 4 times, what happened? What did you do?
Oh, fortunately, I work for the Washington Post, and they helped me renew my U.S. visa, and I was able to leave for a few weeks. I went back because I have a team that I have to take care of them. So that's one side
Okay.
of it.
Thank you. We'll come back.
Yes.
Alan, you wanna?
Oh, use that one,
Yeah, he's got that.
Is this on?
Yeah, it might work better than that.
This situation in Haiti, it's hard to think. When we're so scared right now about what's gonna happen in the United States, I mean, this puts it into some kind of perspective. I really have nothing to add to Dean's brilliant and insightful comments about the significance of what's going to be happening in newsrooms, because I've never worked in a newsroom. I've always been a freelance. There was a time when that was an anomaly. It's not an easy way to make a living, and as my wife can attest, but it's not going to be an anomaly in the future, because more and more, as news staffs have been depleted, they are going to be depending on contract freelancers to go out and do the work. And I just want to raise 3 concerns about that. The first one has already been touched on in this room, that the preparation for freelance journalists is not the same as you get by being mentored in a newsroom, but by constant contact with editor. Believe me, I'm a case in point, because it took years for me and a few kind editors until I finally really understood what it was to be a real journalist. Second is support for those journalists. I was talking to Joel Simon the other day, who used to be in Jodie's position and now is with the Newmark School. And he said, yeah, you're talking about most of my students, and the students who are in this room, same thing. When you go out to report, And say you've got an assignment from some news organization, that does not mean that they are gonna be there to back you up when you need legal help, or when you need to be saved, or when you need expense money. There's a whole lot of things, just like, you know, sorry, you see, Irvine, probably you've got way too many adjuncts working here, if you're like any other university that I know. And why? Because it's an economic good deal for the school. So this is gonna happen with news organizations. It's just gonna be cheaper to use freelancers. Freelancers are going to need the support. You know, the third concern that I have for these freelancers is making a living. It's not easy. Believe me, I've been, very fortunate, but I was doing most of my work in a golden time of journalism, where there were a lot of print magazines that I could write for and get good assignments from. I was a contributing editor for Los Angeles Times Magazine. It does not exist anymore.
Right.
So we are going to have to find ways to financially support these people. The other thing that I wanted to say was that a few years ago, I was interviewing a member of the Sunrise Movement. She was 16 or 17 years old. This was at Greta Thunberg's march in New York City. And she said to me, so what media do you work for? And I said, the slowest one. I'm researching a book. And she said, no, I read some books. It's okay. So she was very sweet. But as Amy mentioned earlier, I've got a new book coming out this spring, and I was recently in a meeting with my agents. I have a couple of them, and my publisher and editor. And at one point, this was right after the election, and at one point, one of my agents turns to me and she says, Alan, you have always made a very, very significant and strategic point about positioning yourself as a journalist, not as an activist. But given what has just happened, he said, you're probably going to be forced to be an activist. And I was thinking, oh, really? I mean, I'm bristling to hear this. But with the targets that we now are going to be having on our backs, if you've never read Sinclair Lewis's 1935 book, It Can't Happen Here, the protagonist in that book is a newspaper editor who ultimately has to become a guerrilla warrior. So
Nervous giggles in the audience.
well, we need to be thinking about these things right now. My reply to my agent, by the way, was, well, I think you're also going to have to become activists, because someone is going to have to defend we authors when our publishers start to self-censor or just want to be a little bit too careful and not just legally vet our books, but also vet them for content that someone might find objectionable. I'm very grateful that my publisher jumped in and said, you don't have to worry about that here. We support you. And I'm very grateful that the major publishing houses in America are now joined in the book banning lawsuit in Idaho and many others. Books are part of this this panorama, and we have to really hope and support our publishers and hold their feet to the fire and make sure that they support us in turn.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you.
Wow, so much to say.
I know,
Not
even gonna
and not
ask you
even
a
understand.
There's enough.
Yeah, I think that, I work at this university and I work with young people. And, I think I see, that every crisis has within it the seeds of something new waiting to be born. So we should ask ourselves as people living this historical moment, what could be on the cusp of being born? And I'm so lucky to work with young writers here because I'm exposed to their thoughtfulness, their critical thinking, their hopes and their frustrations. And the one thing that I really saw, I was off for a year and I came back, was just a kind of an exhaustion with the superficiality, the opportunism, the egotism of social media. I think that young people have really had enough. And especially when they get to the point in their lives when it's time to grow up. There's a certain kind of, the body shaming, for example, of social media. It's just so terrible. People know it's terrible. 17-year-olds, 14-year-olds know it's terrible. And the intolerance of social media, the shrillness of it, it just isn't very human. It's not a good way to grow up. I see from that the germs of a new kind of storytelling. Now, it's really hard to become a writer. I mean, it's always been hard to become a writer. It's like 1 in 10,000 people who set off to become writers when they're 15 or 16. We have careers publishing books, or one in, it's a very difficult thing. But writers will be born. It's just inevitable. And what in my sort of most hopeful moments, I think of this particular moment is something akin to the 1950s. 1950s, you have a period of great conforming. And what gives birth? What does that give birth to? It gives birth to the free speech movement in Berkeley. It gives birth to before that, the Beats, right? This explosion of creativity and activism, and that to me is my great hope. Yes, it's a very, very dark time. I think about the Latino community. We can't even tell our stories. We live in secrecy. The great complexity of the immigrant experience, the telenovela of it, the dysfunction that leads to immigration. We don't want to talk about that because we're like living through our own private little Holocaust.
Right.
And so the Holocaust did not give birth to independent journalism. It was that kind of moment. But having said that, I really believe that that's important to ask critical questions that are at the heart of this particular crisis. And to me, the one that is the closest to me is the crisis of the middle class. And you mentioned that great piece, the shopkeeper next to the homeless camp. And to me, that's really at the heart of where people's anxieties are. You ask young people today, come to my office, Professor Tobar, what our great goal is for me, my generation, to be able to move out of the house. And so I think that inevitably that is going to become that has to be at the center of our storytelling, is to tell these stories about class and especially about the middle class. If you think about what a great thing American journalism was in these glory days that I had a chance to live through, and it's actually living kind of through its own glory days right now, because when you cover a crisis,
So much story.
Yeah, there's so much story. But the open-mindedness of the middle class was reflected in that idea of objectivity. Now you see that when you live abroad. I lived abroad, was a foreign correspondent in countries where there was almost no middle class. And you come back to the States and people are kind of, they're less judgmental. There's like this space where they don't know where to place you yet. And that doesn't really exist so much in, let's say, Buenos Aires or Mexico City, places where I lived. And so that open-mindedness is something that, that sense of fairness, that is what's in crisis right now. I think the crisis of the American media landscape is in many ways a crisis of the middle class and its values, and of the anger that people feel at the disappearance of the middle class and their inability to understand why why the middle class is disappearing. It was a bipartisan process. That we need to be absolutely clear. We're talking about 40, 50 years of economic policy. And so to ask those questions, to embrace both being more critical and more insightful and about things we take for granted. I see great stories about the class crisis in this country, especially about homelessness. But I just think we need to be asking those questions, making connections. Dean, you put it so well, telling stories that are very, very intimate at the same time that they're very critical.
Well, and also Dean pointed out that every story, it can be much more
Yes.
complicated than you ever expect,
Absolutely.
which I think is really important. I mean, when you looked at the Gilets jaunes in France and you thought, oh my God, as a liberal, you thought, what are they doing? Then you
Yes.
realize it is exactly this crisis that you're talking.
Well, and there's so many connections you can make. When in the Latino community, the cartel stereotype dominates our life. And it dominates the telling of the immigrant story. We're either victims or we're cartel operatives. But to me, the crisis of the Mexican state, the crisis of the state in Central America is intimately linked to the Rust Belt and the crisis of the American middle class. And that story is very rarely told that way. There's to me, that story, we need to be making these connections. We need to think like novelists when we do journalism. Think of the wholeness of the story, the wholeness of the person. I think that to me is what I've embraced in my own practice over the years, going from doing journalism to doing fiction, is to embrace the whole person, not to think of the person just as someone to illustrate.
But don't you think that and I was talking to Widlore about this before, and maybe Jodie and Alan have something to say about this, but when, as in the Trump administration, when so many bright, shiny objects are being thrown at you, and some of them include killings every day and burning down of neighborhood and people fleeing for their lives through the streets of a capital city, it's very hard to get to those meaningful stories about, say, the middle class, or in the case of Haiti,
Absolutely.
who's running the show, what's behind it? How do you even begin to report these stories? It's really hard. And I wonder, Jodie, maybe you can talk about what you think is possible or plausible when you're having to train 900 American journalists about how to deal with threats.
So I think one of the things that is important in this moment, and I'm not sure that I agree it's the 50s, I worry we're much more in the 30s, but to be honest, I think this is a whole
Weimar
different.
Republic,
Yeah, I think we're in a whole different era and we need to take it very seriously. I think two things happen that you need to kind of be aware of when all of these things are being thrown at is exactly what Anna said about the reframing. Journalists get reframed in that moment. So whereas in 2016, I think you saw this big move in the US where everyone cohered around this idea that journalism was a kind of apolitical act. It was a democratic good. Democracy dies in darkness. And we could all agree, and the Washington Post saw a big upsurge and the New York Times saw a big upsurge. We are not seeing that this time around because the Overton window has moved and the narrative has successfully shifted to say journalism itself is a political act. The reporting of facts is a political act. That puts us, without journalists having to do anything, in the position of activists because the job of journalism has been reframed as doing something that is not in the public good. And so we're going to have to do a lot of work to explain to people why the work that journalists do is in the public interest, which is why I think a lot of the work rightly will focus around local journalism, because people do trust local journalists. They don't tend to trust the national ones, but they do tend to trust. So that's the first thing. The second thing I think that happens, and we can probably talk about this more, is what happens in these kinds of environments is people retreat. Because the stories are complex to tell, because there's so much coming at you, it's easier for many people to retreat. You retreat to the stories that are safe, you retreat to the stories that are easy, and it means the people who do the difficult stories are highly, highly vulnerable because nobody comes out in their defense. And again, one of the things that's been notable about the US over decades is, unlike many other countries, there was a real strong coherence around the principle of the First Amendment. That meant even when you had a Fox News on one side and a CNN on the other, everybody would agree on the principle that a free press should be defended. I'm not sure we're in that environment anymore, and that's going to make people very, very vulnerable.
So all that Dean was talking about the future of journalism and the hope of younger people and the hardworking local journalists, I'm worried, hearing from Jodie on this panel, and Hector talking about the Latino community and the Haitian situation, Alan saying maybe we have to make this choice between being a writer and being an activist. I'm worried that these very legitimate and interesting concerns about the practice of journalism are going to be sort of swept aside in some kind of terrible movement.
I don't, first of all, we had to own the fact that journalism has never been perfect.
Right.
Right? We ought to admit that, you know, I was in a discussion last week with editors for some of the smaller news organizations, and one very young editor was talking about how great local newspapers were, and I stopped him, I said, no. I grew up in local newspapers, and the worst of them were really bad. So we have to like lose the romance of them. Look, I think it's a generational problem. It's something that's gonna go on for a long time. But I actually do, the reason I'm a little more hopeful, besides the fact that I'm young and naive. The reason I'm hopeful, I actually do think the practice of journalism at its best today is better than it's ever been. We can do more stuff, right? I mean, when I was, the first time I ordered up a video, I wrote a note to Max Frankel and said, I just ordered up a video, and I don't even know how they're gonna do it. The mashup of disciplines, technology has made us better. For all of our fear of technology, my God, trust me, for those who haven't done it, writing a story on a typewriter is a lot harder than writing a story on a computer. And it's just,
That's so true.
and to be able to mash up all of the disciplines. And we're having conversations we should have had generations ago. I mean, the newsrooms I started in, the women had a role in the newsrooms. They were not foreign correspondents. They were not running the newsrooms. The journalism today is just better. It's unfortunate that it's mashing up at a time when people are questioning the values of journalism.
Right.
But that fact is inescapable, and we should hold on to that. I think.
And I think, to be clear, I know it's not, like, I think it's a bad time, but actually, that means journalism matters more than ever.
Right.
Like, in this moment, the job we do matters more than ever, because there are people who want to say that, you know, this is not a microphone, this is not a table, it's an elephant and a cat. And I tell you it's an elephant and cat, so you've just got to believe me, and everybody is nodding. These are, you know, the job of a journalist is to say, you know, is to explain why this is, is to explain why this is a microphone, why this is a, it's really, the work we're doing is really, really important. I think it's a really exciting time. We just need to be very conscious of what is coming down the road.
Right.
Can I have one thing?
Yeah.
I do think that the one thing the biggest mistake we can make, I think, is to in covering, you know, the way the American government is being transformed now, is to not talk to the people who voted.
Absolutely.
The biggest mistake we can make is to not get out into the world and understand, you know, how Trump became president, who voted for him and why. I think if we write off, that is the most unjournalistic act we can do. We need to understand the country. Everybody would admit that in 2016, we did not understand.
We tried.
We tried, and we always try. And we tried again in this last election. I still think it's really hard to understand the country. Oh, it's always been hard to understand the country. But I think we have to keep banging away. I mean, the people in that Eli Zaslow story that I described, I don't know how they voted, but they by the end of it, they probably had a strong,
Right.
Strong anti-immigrant view. I think we gotta get out, do the work, understand the country, understand who voted, and listen to them. And I don't know, I'm not sure the editor I'm gonna quote, or wants me to quote him, but I was at a panel discussion with a senior, editor who's a Black American editor, a couple of weeks ago. And he said, look, my brother-in-law is also Black, voted for Trump. And I'm not surprised. I knew what his life was like and I knew why he voted for him. And all I could think of, I want your brother-in-law on the front page of the
Right.
paper, because I want people to understand that. And the biggest mistake that I think press critics make is when, and the most unjournalistic argument they make is don't talk to him. Well, that ain't journalism. Journalism is talking to people, even people who have things to say that make you uncomfortable.
We love. Oh,
I'm sorry.
go ahead, you go, and then Alan.
Oh, okay.
And then we're gonna have to-
This is a comment that probably comes with a question for Mr. Baquet. I always think about the economic model. Not just because local news organizations like AyiboPost, for instance, are having, trouble,
Staying open.
staying open, etc. But I also think about, big news organizations in the US and the role in covering places like Haiti, right? As we are observing in the US, I think in the past decade, more than half of news organizations, local news organizations, were decimated. As we are observing in places like Haiti, for instance, many US news organizations are not taking enterprise journalism, meaning a lot of them are just reacting to whatever is happening, whether it's an earthquake, whether it's a storm or anything. But we also know how investigative foreign reporting matters under your leadership. Many brilliant and insightful pieces were published by the New York Times about Haiti. And I'm curious, and that's maybe my question, if you see some competitive advantage for US news organizations, for instance, to invest in places like Haiti, invest in the necessity to understand the place, and take the time to really have reporters on the
Right,
ground.
especially a place that's sending migrants to the US.
Absolutely, and many Americans, and it's the last point I would make, many Americans are oblivious to the impact of US foreign policy, US institutions in these places, and it goes full circle. Whether you take the gun issue, more than 70%, the vast majority of guns receiving violence in Haiti comes from the US, all these things.
Sadly, I don't think there's a competitive reason to do it. I think there's a moral reason to do it, and we've tried to do it, and we can do more. I don't think there's look, I think the fewer and fewer big, when I was editor of the LA Times, it had a giant foreign staff. I don't think it has one now, and I don't think that's gonna come back. So there are fewer and fewer news of the big. I think that there is a very powerful obligation to cover Haiti and to cover the world. I think we have we have a lot invested in it. You can find things that we don't do well, and you can find places that will not cover the world. But I think we have the obligation is journalistic. The obligation is moral. The obligation to cover the world and to take all the risks that Jodie's describing. That's a journalistic obligation.
I think it's also smart storytelling.
Yeah.
Because cliche and stereotype are boring.
Yeah.
You lose readers when they know what to expect in the next paragraph.
Right.
And the great lesson of the kind of smart journalism, the best journalism in this country, is that if you approach a story with an open mind and you're open to the nuance and the complexity of it, you'll actually find something that's actually more interesting.
Totally.
And I think that's why,
You
occasionally see those stories.
You also managed to explain phenomena that almost always comes home to the United States in one
Yes.
form.
I'm gonna let Alan have the last word, but I just want to say, I think there are a lot of readers who love stereotype. And when they know what the next thing is gonna say and that they're gonna agree with it, they love that. We know
Well, you're talking
that.
about opinion or news though? Art, you're talking about opinion or news?
I'm talking about news reporting.
Interesting.
Alan.
I think that Hector just said, he sort of teed up this comment very well. I have managed to go, have a pretty interesting career, almost never interviewing a politician. I mean, everybody, you know,
That's a class.
they're so predictable, like, why bother? What I have found, and this is something, by the way, that's some journalists I know, recently I talked to some in Bangladesh and others in China I know who have worked under repressive regimes, have learned to do, that it looks a lot more innocent when you're just going out there and talking to all these normal people, and as opposed to trying to